Well, good morning. Thanks everybody for being here. So nature and the ecosystem services that it provides plays a fundamental role in a municipal infrastructure system. And also the natural assets that provide us with those services are crucial in our experience so far in our ability to withstand the impacts of climate change. I think for us, it really started with a question. We back in around 2012, we wanted to understand how dependent we were on nature to provide services to our residents. Not surprisingly, the answer is that, as we've been finding out, it's that we are highly dependent on nature to function. And so in that sense, you can see that in Gibsons, the many examples where those services are provided. Our drinking water, for example, is stored and filtered in the Gibsons aquifer, and we have little or no treatment to speak of. Our creeks, our foreshore, our forested areas and soil convey the vast majority of rainwater that we receive in Gibsons. And our foreshore, which is still mostly in a natural state, it protects our infrastructure and private property as well from the increasing impacts of sea level rise. We recognize that nature provides us with many other services, including pollination and habitat and others, and well-being in particular. So I'm speaking today primarily from the perspective of a local government. With the realization that we are highly dependent on nature, in 2014, Council deemed nature to be our most valuable asset and directed staff to incorporate natural capital considerations into their decision-making, to our operations, and also into planning, particularly into financial planning. And in the absence of a guide or sort of an approach, we've been trying to put together a revised practice called natural asset management, which uses principles of asset management, which is a really good fit to that. Financial planning, including ecological economics and ecology as well, where work around natural capital valuations and other work and assessments come as well. From asset management, not surprisingly, everything that Kim shared with you at the last session, all of those principles are very good fits to applying it towards natural assets rather than infrastructure, engineered assets. I think the biggest difference that you'll notice is that we're moving away from managing assets as individual classes of assets to managing assets that are themselves attached to a system, a natural system. So moving away from just managing pumps and pipes and managing it from the top of the mountain to the ocean and the whole water system there. It's a bit of a change, and it requires also a change in terms of how we organize, and I'll speak to that in a bit. In terms of financial planning, the fit is not as straightforward as you'd see with asset management. And that has to do with the fact that the national accounting standards, the public sector accounting standards in Canada, don't fully recognize nature as an asset, nature services in particular. And so we've been, you're familiar with the PSAP 3150. There's a process on how we need to account for our infrastructure and note our depreciation of those assets. With natural assets, there's no process, there's no 3151 just yet, but we are in the process of working with PSAB on creating a regime that allows local governments in particular to report on the value of their infrastructure, but also on the value of the services that we get from natural areas. In terms of ecology, condition assessments, valuations, which is ascertaining what the value of a service is, a particular service that comes from nature, and ecology itself. Like, it's an area that we don't necessarily have a lot of experience with, and we've relied on more specialized folks that have specialty in ecological economics, and we started with the David Suzuki Foundation and use the Natural Assets Initiative, where we've created more, we engage with different folks to do that work. So that's the essence of the practice with asset management, financial planning, and ecology. It's what we've been using. We'll explain that a little bit more. As we're talking in terms of climate change, just keeping in mind that from our perspective, what our experience shows is, as much as energy management is the practice that we use for climate mitigation, natural asset management has been our go-to approach for climate adaptation. What we call infrastructure is really a blend of natural and man-made infrastructure that are interconnected and interdependent, function adequately. On that image, you might suggest that for some communities that's a ditch. In Gibsons, that's a valuable asset that provides drainage services year-round and other services as well. But that service in particular is very important to us, just as sort of an example of that. Following the council's direction that I mentioned early in 2014, we were directed to create a policy. And so we started off with our asset management policy. It evolved then to, in the policy, we recognize that we, going forward, have not just engineered infrastructure, we have biomimicry types of assets like bioswales or green roofs, or those are the ones that were designed to mimic nature, but are created. So the types of biomimicry type of assets, and the truly natural assets like our forests or creek or the aquifer or the foreshore, for example. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we moved away from having a department be in charge of a particular asset or class of assets, and have created teams to address, particularly on the drainage and the water system. It's important that we rely on and work with various departments for the maintenance and operation of Michelle will get you into the details of that. And we're also, as I mentioned, moving away from managing a single asset to managing a system or an ecosystem. The other difference that the policy recognizes is that we're encouraged to go well beyond the town's boundary and to understand what is the full size of our natural infrastructure system, which tends to be more of a watershed scale, and we call that boundary sort of an ecological boundary. And that for us is sort of the extent of the work, irrespective of who owns what and who has tenure for the different forms of land that we see. The policy itself defines a natural asset as a feature in the natural environment that provides municipal-like service. That is our definition. And it's really about, it's not about extracting as much service as we can from a natural area. It's actually quite the contrary. It's really about balance and between restoring the ecological integrity of these areas, benefiting from those services, but always finding a balance between those two opportunities, I guess. So not to overuse the asset itself. As you know, nature is undervalued, it's underpriced and overused, and our infrastructure is decaying at a faster rate that we can afford to replace, even if we had the money to do it. So those are the types of challenges that we face, and so restoring natural areas has tremendous benefits to. One of the first questions that we had was sort of around what is the value of the services, trying to understand that we receive from nature. And because a natural asset, as I was mentioning earlier, from a financial planning perspective, it's not the same financially, and it has in fact many advantages. Natural assets have no upfront costs, have no replacement costs if we maintain it properly, or depreciation costs, as you would see with the infrastructure, with the engineered asset. In fact, there's examples where the value of those services and those assets is projected to increase over time rather than to decrease. A natural asset is, by definition, carbon neutral. It can even be carbon positive. We can expand these areas, be it eelgrass or forest or soil, to store even more carbon than we do now. Maintaining natural assets appears to be substantially lower in terms of costs, operating costs, whether you're maintaining a storage pond or an aquifer versus other types of structures they would have to construct. If we maintain it properly, it should last in perpetuity, or at least well beyond what you traditionally have with more engineered infrastructure. And the other, an asset like the one you see on that photo, this park or White Tower Park, and there's many other uses in that space beyond just receiving, storing, and filtering and conveying the storm water in that area, including recreation and habitat and so on. So why do we need to worry about understanding the value of the services that we receive from nature? First of all, from a financial planning perspective, it's a requirement, but it's also a recognized practice within asset management. And we, despite some of the challenges that I mentioned in terms of accounting standards, it's still important for us to understand the value of the services that we get. And in our financial statements, for example, starting in 2013, we had our first note. We have a note that basically says the town is not permitted to report on the value of its natural assets, but it nevertheless recognizes that these assets have value. And we are working with PSAB, as I said, to change that. For capital projects, it's important to where you have the opportunity to see if before you trigger a decision to, let's say, upgrade your stormwater system or part of the system, is there an opportunity to also make investments, or as an alternative, make investments in natural areas that could expand rather than just if you're managing a creek for stormwater services, rather than just getting bigger culverts, is there an opportunity to also restore a wetland or oxbows, or so that in order to understand that, it's important we also accurately price the nature-based alternative, and that's where natural capital valuations come in handy. And I'll tell you about our first one that we did in about 2016. Also, for operations and maintenance, we have line items for these assets, which didn't necessarily, they're all kind of somewhat fell under parks, and is now separated properly under the different services. So for drainage services, these assets will show. And so ascertaining the value of how much money should you set aside to maintain a pond, for example, versus flushing an engineered drainage system. So the cost comparison, it's much lower to maintain these natural areas that we see. Also, from a perspective of risk management, you want to know if you're relying on a particular service, what if you were to lose that asset? What is the financial capacity and security you need to have? So we understand that's this question of risk. And so those are some of the types of reasons why we've gone down the road of trying to understand. And one of our first experiences was this pond that you see there on that image receives the vast majority of the stormwater that falls in Upper Gibsons. It was undersized, so our alternative was to, our proposal was to build a new stormwater system right from Upper Gibsons to the ocean, and we're projecting that to cost between $4.5 and $5 million. We then, working with the David Suzuki Foundation and the Natural Assets Initiative, we undertook our first study of an alternative, and that allowed us to then propose to council an alternative to a piping system to expand the size of the pond, build an additional pond, and at a cost of just over $1 million. So we're saved about 75% or 74% of the cost of the project by considering an alternative in this particular case. That case study was the first project for the Natural Assets Initiative and served as a model to value other assets, and it's what's been used throughout the type of methodology. It was hard to argue with the numbers. For council, who had just less than 2 years prior directed us to come back with sort of a business case for nature as an alternative to an engineered system. And so the White Tower is a great example, and we've tried to replicate that in other areas as we're going through it. What was interesting is it was not just a decision of council to then construct the pond versus the pipe version, is what followed provided us with many other opportunities. So in terms of we had to, with that information, we're able to update our financial plan, because our development cost charges, for example, our DCCs for drainage, we're able to lower that amount by 74%. And that is an example where we can work with the development community to invest in restoring and upgrading natural infrastructure. And in this particular case, provided with a substantial reduction on those costs. We updated, obviously, our stormwater, our subdivision and development standards, because we wanted to reflect our subdivision standards were primarily focused on engineered assets. And so in terms of parks standards and drainage and those two areas, especially if you can connect those assets to those services, is what we would prefer if you're introducing a new subdivision in this area. We also completed valuations on other areas, and Michelle will talk about those coastal areas and the remaining portions of the aquifer of the watershed as well. I think more important question for us is whether we can afford not to maintain these assets, particularly if the more we understand how dependent we are in these areas. What is the level of risk that we're prepared to accept? You know, in the case of the aquifer, we are highly dependent on that asset to store and filter our drinking water. It would be insurmountable for a town like Gibsons to replace that asset. And so our response to that, in order to mitigate that risk, is to invest in the expanded monitoring. And you see just the breadth of the work that Michelle's been doing, expanding our monitoring, and it has to do with wanting to have as early as possible information about the condition of the asset, and so to avoid any future losses, of course. The impact on the financial impact in the community could be quite severe as well, in terms, including property damage and business interruption. And so from a risk perspective, we can't afford not to do that. Slide. Okay. I think from a watershed scale, making a watershed resilient to climate change requires alignment and integration of the different agencies that operate in this area. So if you've been to Gibsons, from the top of Mount Elphinstone to the ocean, there's 8 different agencies that regulate a cubic meter of water. And within them, they have at least 20 policy areas that influence how that drainage is occurring across the land. And that's everybody from the Ministry of Forests, Parks, BC Parks, Energy and Mines, Ministry of Transportation, the Regional District, the Health Authority. All of these folks have a role, and it's very uncoordinated. So from our perspective, we're asking the province to, within this ecological area that we've worked to define, we would like to see that area have a particular designation, a water sustainability plan designation, which will then, it's the highest form of tenure that the province has available, which they've only used once or twice. But we think that if we're going to tackle climate change at a watershed scale, we need more tools than we have now. I think that alignment and integration is a key part of it to address, whether to address droughts or floods or sea level rise. So that's, and then the scale itself is, we got a question of scale, and we have a question of governance. So on the scale, I spoke a little bit about that. As we're, 20 years ago when I started, we're sustainability per se, it was sort of something we strived to do at sort of at the home scale or neighborhood scale. But now we recognize that we need to go well beyond our boundaries and actually understand what is the extent of our interconnection with nature and how we operate as a community. We have done quite a bit of work with our regional colleagues on watershed governance and are in line for a designation of this area that it's led by the indigenous communities here, and particularly Squamish Nation, and the Shishal Nation was also on the Sunshine Coast. And it requires a collaborative model and this idea of teams. We've recently entered into a watershed agreement with a regional district that starts to incorporate these principles that the scale that we think it's important for us to be working at. Our goal ultimately is to have infrastructure that is the most natural, the most energy efficient, the most reliable, and that it costs the least to operate over the long term. And it's difficult to do that, to have this goal without incorporating natural assets into our financial planning and our asset management. In our experience, whether you're looking at it in terms of costs or risk or for environmental objectives, it's nature is a very good investment, and the Town of Gibsons can do the work that we've been doing. We don't see any reason why other local governments really shouldn't venture down that road as well. Just a couple more things in terms of to think about. In terms of planning and development, when you're considering climate adaptation, we go well beyond just asset management or natural asset management per se. We've also tried to embed climate resilience into our official community plan, particularly in the areas of development permit guidelines. We've created an expanded series of guidelines for development permit for aquifer protection, and we think that had a lot to do with providing us this protection. In essence, you're required to have the proposal reviewed by a hydrogeologist and also a geotech engineer. So these additional protections are very important, and also the fringe area planning that we're talking about in the future. So that connection between sort of the two sides to development, to growth and development in the communities, trying to find the right balance, which sometimes is the disconnect between our objectives in the official community plan and what our subdivision standards actually ask the developer to build, and third, sort of in terms of our ability to maintain those assets once we inherit. We want less infrastructure, not more. Wherever a new neighborhood is being proposed, we want it to be as natural as possible. But that requires good alignment on new policies. Also, as I mentioned, the subdivision standards in particular, where the drainage, sort of this trying to share and create this vision for a sponge city, which is a concept that comes out of China and other parts of the world. But the idea is to find opportunities, and you'll hear from Michelle also in the work for us to understand every plot of land, what is their qualities in terms of receiving, because we want to receive as much water as possible, filter and allow it to sink into the aquifer. At the same time, we need surface water to convey at a rate that doesn't degrade the natural areas or causes issues for other types of infrastructure. And even in terms of emergency planning, I think this connection between climate change and emergency response, whether it's response to floods or to fires. Fortunately, got my fingers crossed, we've had little concern with either one of those, but that's not, but we've done work to try to understand how best to prepare ourselves, particularly around the floods and so on, which despite some of the severe weather that we've been getting, our drainage system is getting more and more resilient. That's some comfort there. The water system itself, we've expanded in terms of resource management, our aquifer monitoring, and we'll hear that from Michelle, as I mentioned, creek monitoring, and we have invested also in cross-connection control. So that's because we don't treat our water, it requires a higher sense of protection from devices in this particular case. Even at the wastewater treatment plant, being a seaside community, we have assets that are right at the ocean. But we've been investing in, I don't know what the percentage is, but a large percentage of our, specifically a large percentage of our capital program in the last 5 years, and if you look what we're planning to do in the next 10, is about building up the resilience of our infrastructure to deal with climate change. And at the treatment plant, for example, not only are we raising the site, raising the pump stations and rebuilding those, that has to do with obviously sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. On the other side of the plant, per se, we're trying to reduce, when you see the peak flows and the severe rain events, that plays havoc with the treatment plant because we want to maintain a high quality of treatment. And that has required us to make investments in expanding the surge capacity of the plant so we can receive that water at those times. But to us, it's all looking at it from a lens of risk. And I think that we need a few more years and more strategic investments. On that image that you see there, to sort of those connect sort of Lower Gibsons or Upper Gibsons to Lower Gibsons, and you'll see there are 3 smaller creeks that run through this area, and we recently got a substantial grant, multi-million-dollar grants to rebuild and restore these lower watershed for climate adaptation, because this area, because of our development, has gotten quite sort of constrained with growth, and we're trying to renaturalize some of these areas. But a lot of it is to reduce the impacts of climate change on that space. Eventually, in Upper Gibsons is where we have the White Tower Park that I was mentioning earlier. It's up in this area. And then up in the watershed, we have considerable drainage issues, but they are primarily in Crown land. So our work there is working with the region and with the province on the expanded monitoring, and it will make more context when you see what Michelle has to say there. One other area that I would want to say in terms of what else are we including incorporating natural capital considerations into our work is around these limited resources we have. As much as we can, we try to close the loop on reusing. It's not a full water reuse station, but we're trying to reuse, particularly for our industrial purposes, as much water from the treatment plant as possible. We treat our biosolids to a Class A compost just down the road. We've got a very strong organics diversion. We're well over 40% in terms of diversion since about 2017, I believe. And we collect all green waste in this area, but we don't encourage any burning. In terms of all of this work that we've been doing on the resource management has been in conjunction with First Nations here, with the Salish Soils in particular. It's a great local firm. So it's nice to have this capacity here and do that work. Related to with climate, you know, in terms of energy and emissions reductions, that work continues, of course, although it's not as simple as choosing to install solar in our buildings or to plant trees. I wish it was sort of that simple. I think ultimately, as we prepare our adaptation plans and our mitigation plans, in fact, we don't really have an adaptation plan. We have a resilience strategy, which sort of, there are two important areas that I think in terms of work. The prioritization, I'm curious to hear from you when we get to talk a little bit more later this morning. How are you prioritizing this push and pull between mitigation and adaptation? Because we find that we've identified, we have a framework for resilience, and ultimately we'll sort of arrive at a place where you got to determine which one to do, let alone which one to do first. And there's a bit of this conflict. So I think folks like SFU and others trying to determine a way that sort of that we can better make those choices, because I don't think it's possible for us to do everything in every plan. And even then, for the amount of time that we have, my sense is that we're going to spend more time on improving our resilience in terms of our ability to withstand the impacts of change, rather than things like energy production or energy efficiency and so on. Just, we had to choose, that's probably where our priorities would go. But you know, there will be discussion. I'm anxious, be good to hear from you what we're doing there. We're doing the same things as everyone else. We're trying to do energy retrofits and install solar EV charging networks and that type of work. The integration and the prioritization, though, will be, I think, where our challenge lies. And so I just leave that as a thought. In the meantime, I'll wrap up, and we can hear from Michelle if she's ready. And thank you for the time to share some of these thoughts as a start. Stop sharing here. Okay.
Thank you so much, Emanuel, for listening and taking some notes around some questions. I see there's a question in the chat that we can maybe answer while Michelle is getting her presentation ready. How does that sound? Okay, it's from Jesse. I don't know, Jesse, if you'd like to ask yourself, or I can read it out.
Yeah, sure. I can ask. Thank you. It's a good presentation. I'm just wondering, Emanuel, when you do your natural asset valuations, if those numbers for the natural asset come in above proposed construction project asset value, is that construction project pushed to a redesign to, you know, come in line with the natural asset value, or, you know, push it out of the way of the higher value natural asset, or how do you work through that?
Sure, I understand your question. So would you mind repeating that question?
Sure. So I guess if you're valuing your natural assets, you know, and you're looking at city development and you're trying to, you know, put in a new neighborhood, but the natural asset value for the, you know, filtration and what you expect the city the cost to the city will be for services for that neighborhood. If that natural asset value is higher, then is that project kind of nixed or pushed into a redesign, or how do you look at those valuations versus, you know, the approvals process?
So our biggest, an evaluation that we did for the White Tower, I thought the numbers were really different, but they were quite surprising. So the cost to build a pond versus a pipe, the pond is 25 cents on the dollar, so it's much cheaper to build, but it's also much cheaper to operate. So that motivated us. So to give you an example, we expect to dredge those new ponds, about every 2 or 3 years at a cost of maybe $50,000 to $60,000, give or take. The maintenance, on an annual maintenance of the stormwater pipe option, was projected to be between $85,000 and $100,000. So in that sense, yeah, it was certainly cheaper there. We haven't had a case where nature was more expensive, which is not to say, so if you look at the seawall, it's another example, our foreshore space. If we were to sort of do hardened concrete seawall, let's say I run us between 1,000 and 1,500 a meter, linear meter, and a natural asset, sort of a naturalized area. This is with rip wrap and rock materials and some habitat built into it as well. We're expecting to do that for under $1,000 a meter. So far, those have been sort of the types of examples that, and we'll have another opportunity for these creeks to see how sort of it matches up. So I don't know, if Jesse, if that addressed your question.
I think so. I think when you said you haven't had a value of the nature being higher yet, it kind of frames it a bit. So it's trying to use natural assets in place of constructed assets, but not necessarily saying that the project's not approved because the natural asset value is higher than, say, what the proposed construction would be. So thank you.
Yeah, I will add to that too, that there's the case that natural assets are going to appreciate over time as well. So, you know, the ponds are going to be, they'll be functioning better. They'll be providing more value as time goes on as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, should I start sharing, Jillian?
Yes, please. Yeah, that's
Okay.
great.
Okay. Can you see that okay? Yes?
Yeah, yeah, it looks great.
Okay, okay, good.
Well, we are in presenters mode. We see your presenter on screen.
Okay.
So you go up to the display settings. There we go.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks to Manny for that background on natural asset management in Gibsons. I'll just give a bit of an overview of how I came into this role. I started in the Parks Department within the Town of Gibsons, and it's a very small department. We're a very small community. We're less than 5,000 people. And I found that I came from kind of an environmental horticulture background, and I found that the way that things were being done in the Parks Department were a little bit status quo, and that there wasn't too much innovation happening in terms of how we were looking at our green spaces and balancing that with this being a tourist town and having it look nice for folks coming to visit as well. Sorry, I'm just trying to move that. Okay, so in 2020, I started as the Natural Asset Technician. It was a role that was created as a 6-month term position originally, just I guess to see if it was viable as a position, and it quickly became apparent that it was. My first task was to write a tree preservation bylaw, which was adopted by council in 2020, at the end of 2020. And that was kind of our first pass at urban forest management plans. And around that same time, I was actually pulled in, and the first natural asset management project that I did with the town, and it was called the Managing Natural Assets for Coastal Resilience. So this project was in partnership and collaboration with the Natural Assets Initiative, which Manny had mentioned earlier. And that we also had a consultant named Essa Consulting that worked with us on the project. And the big questions that we were looking to answer through this pilot project was, what are some natural infrastructure options that we could use to create resilience for our foreshore? So like Manny had shown in one of his slides, we're a fairly small community and we have lots of shoreline, and we have a lot of infrastructure, built infrastructure right along the edge of the foreshore. And so what we wanted to do is, what impacts from sea level rise and increased storm surges would happen to the coastline, and what natural asset options, what could they provide? What benefits could they provide? And so we looked at options like beach nourishment, shoreline plantings, enhancing our eelgrass beds, which are a form of wave attenuation. And then we even looked at things like submerged structures, like submerged breakwaters. And also armoring of the beaches, like with riprap or by anchoring logs. And the key learnings were that the options that we modeled were not really providing much protection against flooding and erosion because of the characteristics of storms here on the West Coast, or in our area. But what we did find was that there were flood and erosion benefits, though minimal, but there was also a myriad of co-benefits, which we talk about a lot in natural asset management. So there's, habitat provision. There was like biodiversity benefits, and that we found, like I just mentioned before, about the valuation of a natural asset increasing over time, that this would just continue to increase their value. We did find that natural assets were, they provided greater protection for smaller, less frequent storms, more frequent storms than the large, big storms. But one thing that this, actually, I'll go to the next slide. So it showed us, like you can see on the screen right now, these are results from left to right, from a 1 year storm, 1 and 2 year storm, and a 1 and 100 year storm. So you can see, pardon me, in pink here, it shows the wave run up, which is more of an impact than more of a in this area, more of a risk than erosion. It's just like inundation of this area. It's quite a low point around the harbor. And what we did find was that within these natural asset options that we chose, we found that there were the damages in the range of around $3.4 million from a storm, 16.2 million over a 100-year storm. And then what this project did tell us through the limitations were that there was other opportunities to look at other initiatives like lagoons, canals, retaining walls, large dikes. But one thing that came out of it was that the town and most coastal communities, I would argue, should be looking at and exploring options for planned or managed retreats, which I find is a very emotional conversation to have with communities. So what I want to talk about mostly is just about understanding, and for us, it's the most important, for me, it's the most important piece when I'm doing these projects, is understanding not only what we have as far as natural assets, but how they interact with other natural assets, how they interact with engineered infrastructure, and how they're all connected. So like Manny had said, the aquifer is our source of drinking water. On the image on the right, you can see it is outlined in blue. So that's the extent as we know it so far of the aquifer. The black outlined area is the Town of Gibsons boundaries. So as mentioned by Manny earlier, our natural assets and our this extends way beyond the boundaries of the Town of Gibsons. The region outlined in white is what we consider the aquifer recharge area. So this is the top point is the top of Mount Elphinstone, and then it extends out well beyond the boundaries into the Sunshine Coast Regional District. As far as connecting with the ocean, the aquifer, you can see down in this area here, this is underneath Gibsons Harbor. So it's we have to be cognizant of sea level, or sorry, salt intrusion as well. So the aquifer mapping studies that we have done, we update any new drilling information we get from development or from our own monitoring wells, is we put into our what's called a leapfrog model, and it just gives us more confidence in understanding what's there. And that's what I'm saying, that it's all about understanding, is that every study that we do and every report that comes out, it kind of it brings up more questions than, and so it's like this, because we're talking at the system scale, like Manny was talking about the ecological scale, it lends me to trying to understand, well, how is that connected? So you can see in the main image here of the aquifer on the left, this is a cross section. The orange is the aquifer 560, which is where we draw our drinking water from. And you can see that, hopefully you can see, there's a couple different creeks here where my cursor is. And so sometimes these creeks, through our understanding, is that they insize in through this green layer, which is the confining unit of the aquifer. And so when that occurs, there's these are potentially areas of infiltration into the aquifer, and they're also areas that the aquifer could be charging the creeks. And this is important because when we're trying to do aquifer protection, we need to look at these areas, and we need to understand where these areas are, as far as like protecting them through development permit areas, or protecting them from pollution from like upstream development, from upstream like practices like logging and mining. And so when I started looking at this aquifer study and started thinking, okay, so there is an interaction between the surface water and the groundwater, but what don't we know, and what do we need to figure out, and how are we going to do that? The interesting thing is that the aquifer mapping study, they came out with recommendations, and so we've been working through that. But even those conversations with our hydrogeologists, that brings up more conversations, or sorry, more questions for them too, about, okay, what don't we know? How are we going to find this information? And so it's kind of led to and fed into another project, the next project that we started working on, which was called the Source to Sea. So the Source to Sea project is it was a natural asset inventory, risk assessment, scenario modeling, and essentially outputs on stormwater valuation for the entire watershed. So the image on the left here shows, again, that same outline. We use the same project area, which is the aquifer recharge area. And what you see on the left is a dashboard that we created that looks at condition for each of these assets. So you can see the wheel on the bottom, and this is kind of following natural asset management as well, and looking at that circular process where you're inventorying and you're assessing and you're planning and repeating. And so this showed, this was a desktop review, and it showed that like based on things like when we're looking at forests, for example, based on if there's cut blocks, like operating plans for timber sales, if those are impacting these forested areas, or if there is large developments adjacent to these natural areas, then that would decrease their condition. The great thing is the team that I worked with on this, they would bring this to me for review, and then because it was only a desktop review on their part, then I could do like my like site specific analysis of each of these areas. So then after we did the identification and the condition assessment, then we looked at risks to each of these assets. And I wanted to bring up, because Jillian, you talked about that Kim talked about the FCM asset management readiness scale, and that was a component of our Source to See project. We did, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Did you have?
No, just in case you're wanting to.
Oh, okay. So what we did with natural asset with the Natural Assets Initiative through this project is that they adapted that asset management readiness scale to be a natural asset management readiness scale. And so we actually worked with our counterparts at the Sunshine Coast Regional District and the District of Sechelt to look at where we're all at, the three communities are at as far as natural asset management maturity. And that kind of gave us a baseline idea as to where we're at and where we should be working towards. And so through that, the project itself, the Source to See project, we found that it was quite iterative and quite dynamic. And because the project, it's still not complete, it'll be completing this fall. But we've been working on this for 4 years, I believe. And we're finding that just like the aquifer study, just like the coastal resilience study, is that it's more questions are coming up about how these systems interact with each other, and what do we need to increase our understanding. And so sorry, back to the study itself, is on the right hand side, you can just see this is our management option or scenario modeling that we did. And we chose what we were trying to understand was, when we go back to this valuation piece, if we were to remove the forest in a certain area within Gibsons, like on these undeveloped parcels or these park areas, then that's the stormwater service that forest provided in dollars, like what would we need, what size stormwater pond would we have to build to account for all of that additional water. And so we looked at a couple different ones. We looked at enhancing or restoring forests in certain areas, and then what would that mean for stormwater valuation services. If we decreased the forest in certain areas, if we increased wetland areas. And then from those, we found that there were this is for the entire watershed, there's $38 million in stormwater mitigation benefits. The forests were $3.1 million, $31.5 million combined. So that was that was more than the wetlands and the riparian areas. And we found that wetlands, they had the smallest contribution overall, but they provided the greatest benefit per hectare. So they were $1.4 million per hectare as opposed to $0.1 million for forest and riparian areas. So, so we use that again, we would use that information to look at our subdivision development services bylaw, to look at, you know, are the developers designing the right kind of stormwater management ponds to account for the decrease in these forested areas. And we found that the stormwater mitigation services provided by the natural assets in the watershed, they'll increase by about 1.7 million to a total of 39.7 million as future precipitation increases with climate change. And on that point, I wanted to go back to that piece on like understanding and what do we need to know. When we started the project and we were working with a stormwater modeler, he found that the precipitation stations that we had access to in this region, there was one that just did daily precipitation values, not hourly. And then the other closest ones that did hourly were kind of in a rain shadow, or sorry, a rain heavy precipitation area of this mountain, like probably 5-10 kilometers from here. And then the other one was way up the coast, about 20 kilometers. And so he just kind of used an average of the two of them because that's the only available data we had. And so that kind of started our conversations about, okay, what are we trying to understand and what are these data gaps? And so luckily this project spanned so many years. And so we were able to, now we've put in climate stations like precipitation and temperature stations within our own watershed. We have 6 of them now. It's a little bit too late for this project, but it's still, that was one of the outputs, is this is something that we need to have, and it's increasing the network for Environment Canada as well. And then the other thing that we needed to do through this project, because we were looking at, you know, this is how much rain is falling in Mount Elphinstone, and then what are the outputs in our creeks? And so when we're looking at, flooding and like the need for stormwater ponds, we needed to understand how much flow is actually coming out of these creeks. So we installed, in 2021, we installed hydrometric stations in the 3 creeks, that track flow and temperature. And I work with a consultant, and we go out and we do spot measurements that kind of develop a rating curve, so we know, you know, when there's 6 inches or 30 centimeters of water going through the creek, we know that the flow rate will be X amount, because based on that. Yes, Jillian?
Hey, thank you so much. I don't want to interrupt your flow. I just wanted to say we do want to make sure we're leaving time for some questions. So
Oh, right, yes.
wanted to make sure if there's any other points that you wanted to make, that we make them so we can open it up.
Great. Okay, thanks, Jillian. Okay, so the last piece was talking about just next steps. And so like Manny had mentioned, to increase our monitoring network, which is, again, these more hydrometric stations, more climate stations, more monitoring wells for the aquifer, so that we're understanding all of these things. We're actually putting all of this data that we have, this real-time data, and we're putting it all into one software called Aquarius that the province uses, and that way we'll be able to look at aquifer levels, precipitation levels, and creek levels all within the same software. The other thing is we're doing an infiltration study for the creeks, like, because I mentioned that those were areas of high potential for aquifer infiltration. So we're going to be completing that this fall. And as mentioned by Manny, we are working with our regional partners on watershed agreements, and we're developing what we're calling a one water strategy, which is, again, increasing that monitoring and increasing that collaboration with our regional partners on all, like, drinking water, stormwater, all of this. So I think I'll just end it there. Thanks, Jillian.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So you've done so much work. It's really, I don't know how others around the virtual table are feeling, but there's been so much work done. so much to learn from. I have a couple questions here, but before I pop in, I want to turn it over to participants if they have any questions or comments that they'd like to make. Just processing all the information. Well, maybe I'll get us warmed up a little bit. One thing that's really coming through to me is the work that you've taken to really put a number of value on the natural assets in and around your community. And I'm wondering if you have any transferable lessons to communities starting out in terms of how to do that, if there's any benchmarks or tools or kind of ways of approaching that piece.
Just make a couple comments around the valuation. It was our first sort of area to focus on was, what is the value of these services? And I always very careful not to sort of confuse. We never attempted to put a price on nature. It's not it at all. It's just that if you don't do the analysis, then it's simply left out of the consideration. It's not really accounted for. You're inadvertently attributing a zero value. So that is sort of our reason for doing it. Ultimately, what we want people to appreciate is I think not necessarily to rush to find out what's the value of the service, but to really all starts with this awareness of how are you as a community, working with nature and how dependent on you. I think that's a more important question than what is your creek worth or and so, but let's just say if you wanted to go ahead and do evaluation, one of the first reasons you'd want to do that is to understand what from a question of risk, what if you were to lose that service, to try to appreciate that we're talking substantial amounts of money. I know it's just throwing money around, but that's so the first is sort of understanding the relationship and the dependency. The second is understand what's at stake if we don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that should be motivation enough. And I can't think of a town in BC or anywhere that isn't. It's just that we haven't been directed to, or we haven't really had to, but I think we're there now where I think it's impossible to prepare a response to climate change without having to address these questions.
Thanks, Manny.
Julian, I just want to jump in and add to that as far as any tools or ways to do this, what we've done with the Natural Assets Initiative is you look at replacement costs. So you look at what it would cost to build something to deal with that, like for this example,
right,
with the amount of additional rainfall.
Yeah, that's a good way in. I have one other question for the group, actually. As we're going through, I find myself thinking about my own community, and I'm wondering if any of the participants would like to share a natural asset in your region that you thought about during the presentation, or maybe thought about with new eyes in terms of the value it brings for climate preparedness. I don't know if anyone wants to.
Maybe I back in the mid 2000s, and before this work was even going, obviously, when I lived up in Dawson Creek, we had frequent flooding. I guess that's over time certainly increased in severity. But at one point, we considered expanding a wetland, sort of, for those that are in that area between the golf course and the 17th Street, so on the back of that. And we intuitively knew that if we held some of that water and then release at slower rate, would have less impact downstream. And but we didn't have a way to do a comparison, so we ended up investing many times that amount, sort of upgrading the size of the culverts and eventually turning it into bridges. And I think I often think about that example, like what if it would have been possible to do that to so I think don't want to miss those opportunities as we go forward. I don't know, I think we could think of many others, you know, the Queen's Slough, that's, you know, plays a great role in stormwater management as well, in that space. So there's a sort of a couple of areas that I sometimes think about.
Thanks for that, Manny. Elena, did you have any questions you wanted to share?
Yes, one thing that stood out when I was listening to both your stories was that it sounded like you had a council that was quite supportive of this work. And I was curious what that looked like at the beginning of your process, and if there was some work done earlier to get their buy-in, and what that looked like.
Yeah, we reached out to council in 2012, and there was a new council that came in, and their two primary goals were to develop an asset management strategy, which we didn't really have one. And at the time, the conversation around infrastructure was closing the infrastructure gap. And of course, for us, there was too large of an amount to even consider. And so we were encouraged to think a little bit differently, I guess. So the motivation was primarily asset management, and you'll see in our policy, in our earlier work around ecological economics, it's very not so much focused on nature, but more focus on infrastructure and and finances, because it was the council, you know, and we called our strategy, you know, a natural capital preservation strategy. Like it wouldn't have gotten the support, but we were talking about reducing infrastructure costs and reducing risk and increasing the level of service. And that was an easier sell. And within a couple of years, you know, being able to say, you know, we're going to save almost $4 million by doing this rather than this. And that kind of sealed the deal. It's like, okay, bring us more. What else can we do? And sort of that was the motivation there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful to know how you communicated that.
We worked a lot on the language, and I think our language today has evolved to, you hear that from Michelle, resilience. We talk lots about resilience. So all that we're talking about is we want to restore our community so that we can withstand the impacts of climate change. And we at the moment, we're talking about sort of resilience ratings. So every one of our communities has different ratings. We've got economic ratings, and we've got fire ratings, and we think it's possible to develop a resilience rating. So what is our ability to recover from a disturbance? Our ability to recover is, you know, if you look at what sort of took us down at the treatment plants, flooding, we see less of that, and that's very purposeful. So we're trying to increase that ability to recover, and that's fundamentally what climate adaptation is. And so in Gibsons, you know, I don't know if we're a 3.5 or we're a 4 out of 5, but we're about to find out. We've been working on a model to incorporate all of these considerations. So we've got all of the sort of the natural sort of condition assessments. We've got economic data, we've got social data, and we want to be able to demonstrate on the land what is the impact of a policy. So we anticipate that by next year, when we're in council, that we'll present them options of all the 35 or so actions we've identified that we should take action on climate. We want to be able to run those options and see how it impacts these scenarios. So that is combines. That's why we were saying earlier that it's not that simple to just simply choose renewables or trees. It's a lot more complex, and so the modeling is one of the pieces, one of the tools that it's a resilience model, and we'll have that available pretty soon, actually.
Just before the break, we've got 4 minutes. I have another question I want to ask Michelle, but again, I want to make sure participants have a chance to bring up anything that may be in the back of your mind. If not, I'll just take the opportunity. Michelle, you mentioned that conversations around retreat can be difficult, and as you know, in the Northeast there was a very difficult summer this year with fires, and lots of conversations I'm sure were ensuing. And I wondered if you had any experience or knowledge or thoughts to share around these very sensitive conversations when communities are understanding at what point are we building resistance and what point are we needing to prepare for retreat. I wondered if you had any reflections to share with us.
My reflection would be that because of that result from the Coastal Resilience Project, I didn't know what to do. To be honest, I felt like this was a project that council had supported, and they were given a copy of the report at the end. And I feel like, I'm speaking totally candidly here, but I feel like I should have prepared a presentation for council, but I didn't have any answers. And it was a larger conversation about how does this align with our official community plan? How does this align with our council's strategic priorities? Like, this isn't really a conversation that has come up publicly, as in my experience, as far as I know. And so I know that these conversations, I'll have them with other folks that are in like coastal zones, like other consultants. And I know that if you're looking for more information, that we partnered on this pilot project with the Pointe de Chêne in New Brunswick. They did their coastal resilience at the same time that we did ours. And I know that that was the best option for them as well. And so I think that they're doing some work towards that with their community. I know that there's events down in the States where they'll have whole workshops dedicated to like how to speak to your community and how to speak to your council or your governing body about managed retreat. But yeah, and I think for me, it's always about enough data. Like for me to have, to be able to tell my story about like why would we look at managed retreat and what would that look like, and having enough information to be able to convey that that option, I guess.
Thanks, Michelle. Emmanuel, I see your hands up.
Yeah, which is not to say that we haven't had the conversations. Our conversation here has been a little bit different. So what we do see is the level of anxiety, and that has come from there's been a fear that we're running out of water, and it's hard to convey. We use a relatively low amount of water on a per capita, and we have enough water for our present and our future needs as far as we can tell at the moment. But it's hard to tell that to people for them to have confidence. So we're trying to come up with ways to reassure that anxiety, which is quite noticeable. And the other part around anxiety that has come out quite strongly is around these fires. And it's not enough to tell people that we have good planning in place. We've got evacuation routes, we've got people to call on. This water and fire has been very top of mind, not so much about retreat. Retreat that needs to happen on the waterfront, for example, is limited to some properties, and those are very few, and they're primarily recreational type properties, so it's less concern there. But water and fire, it's a work in progress.
Thank you for that. And Elena, before we go to the break, last comment to you.
Okay, one last quick question. Michelle, you mentioned that you had adapted FCM's asset management readiness scale for natural assets. And I was curious, the result of that, is that a public resource or just something you're keeping internally?
I don't know if Manny has any comments, but I'm not sure, because you might want to check the Natural Assets Initiative website, because they have a lot of reports, publications, and resources on there. And I know, I mean, this isn't an internal thing. This is something that they've done with other folks as well, so.
Are you talking about us sharing that? I don't see any issue with sharing.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I'm happy to share, because that was part of our project, and our project final report will be coming out next month, I believe, so, yeah. It's interesting. It was just a template for, and it just spurred on a lot of conversations too. It was quite an interesting process.
Great. Yeah, we can gather that and send it around for the
Sure.
closing. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I want to just again extend my heartfelt thank you for donating your time today. It means a lot when we have practitioners with such experience to come and share. So thank you so much.